By now, the idea of the quote-unquote world car is pretty well established in the auto industry. Why try to sell a bunch of different cars in a bunch of different markets when you can sell one car everywhere that works okay enough? But few cars have enjoyed the same international relevance as the Renault 12, an automobile which, on the surface, seems about as boring as its alphanumeric name. In reality, the story of this car is remarkably complicated, expansive, and just plain long. Millions were sold in dozens of countries under probably tens of different names over 3.5 decades. So sit back, relax, and learn about how this random European family car took on the entire world. The story of the R12 begins in France in the mid-60s, when Renault was seeking to replace the rear-engined 8 and 10. Its design was intended to be more conventional than the more upmarket R16, arguably one of the first hatchbacks. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was conventional. It was originally supposed to have one headlight on one side and two headlights on the other, for some reason. It used a longitudinal front-wheel drive layout with the engine ahead of the front wheels, presumably for maximum understeer, featured fairly distinctive sloping front and rear ends, and originally used an odd dash-mounted parking brake. With that being said, this was intended to be a world car from the very beginning, and so concessions were made for the sake of simplicity and dependability. It had drum brakes in the rear instead of the 16's discs, a simple beam axle instead of independent rear suspension, and base models used in large engines with blocks made of iron rather than aluminum. The Renault 12 was launched at the 1969 Paris Motor Show with an elaborate smoke-filled display designed to emulate the new family car floating in space. The design was somewhat unconventional, but perhaps not to the same degree as other French cars being produced at the time. The 1.3-liter inline-4 produced around 60 horsepower, which seems relatively appropriate for a 1-ton mainstream European commuter. The motoring press seemed to like the 12, with reviewers praising its riding seat comfort, handling, and compelling value for money. Admittedly, some of them didn't appreciate its heavy steering, noisy engine, and high load lip for the trunk, but realistically, no 1970s economy car was perfect. Over the years, its appeal was broadened with the introduction of a station wagon, or brake because French, followed by a 3-door van variation, helping the 12 become quite popular across Western Europe.
On apprend à conduire au-delà des limites, les bras emmêlés sur le volant. Mais le plus rigolo n'est pas forcément le plus efficace, et le verdict des chronomètres est parfois sévère.
Following the footsteps of the French racing legend that was the R8 Gordini, the R12 Gordini featured the Renault 16's aluminum 1.6-liter engine, twin Weber carburetors, and other upgrades that gave the little sedan an impressive 125 horsepower. Its eye-catching wheels, wider tires, fog lights, and signature blue paint with white stripes turned the standard 12 into a genuinely exciting vehicle. Apparently, there was even an option to upgrade the camshaft and add 2 double-barrel Delaretto 40 carburetors, allowing power to approach 160. Unsurprisingly, Gordini versions of the R12 are very sought after today. They're quite hard to find due to their rarity and the cruel passage of time, but still pop up for sale every once in a while. But as cool as the Gordini is, the R12's incredible amount of global identities are what truly cement it in the history books. It was almost as if state-owned Renault was tasked with single-handedly starting a new era of French imperial expansion. Anyway, let's start in Brazil, where the Renault 12's national presence had a bit of an unusual backstory. Willys Overland, the American company responsible for the original Jeep, entered the Brazilian market in 1952, before much of its competition, in an attempt to offset the firm's failing domestic operations. The division actually developed a fair amount of autonomy and partnered with Renault to produce the Dauphine locally, beginning in 1959. Eventually, Renault acquired a minority stake in the firm, resulting in a limited-run version of the Alpine A108 dubbed the Willys Interlagos, and a new family sedan designed to slot between the Dauphine and the more upmarket Aero Willys. Apparently, Willys of Brazil president William Max Pierce got rejected by the bigwigs at what was now Kaiser Jeep's California corporate headquarters when he asked for funding, and would have flown back to Brazil were it not for an encouraging fortune cookie at a Chinese restaurant. But whatever the backstory, the new car was approved and was to be developed alongside the Renault 12 in France. As such, unlike some of the other cars on this list, this was more than just a case of simple badge engineering. Right before the car, originally dubbed Project M, debuted in 1968, the year before the Renault version, by the way, Ford bought out the entirety of Willys of Brazil. That meant that even though they had little to do with its development, the vehicle would actually be known as the Ford Corcel. In addition to apparently being the perfect automobile to save a damsel in distress, the Corcel's styling really didn't look that out of place with a Ford badge on it, at least to my eyes. Project M featured a much more conservative, square design than the 12, with, perhaps as expected, a lot of American influences. At least from the rear, that is. For some reason, the front end reminds me of the BMW Neue Klasse cars from the same era. But despite the new design, the Corcel still shared most of its hardpoints and running gear with the 12. That included the 1.3-liter Renault Cleon engine, which was now locally produced in Brazil. The Corcel was quite a big deal in the Brazilian car market when it launched. It was the first car to have standard front disc brakes and a collapsible steering column. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing for Ford Brazil. 1968 also marked the launch of the successful Chevrolet Opala and Volkswagen 1600 in the country. Additionally, some buyers felt the Corcel's engine was underpowered and were distrustful of its newfangled front-wheel drive layout, especially on bad roads and poor weather conditions. In 1970, it was also the subject of Brazil's very first automotive recall, an improperly tuned steering system. Luckily for Ford, all of that wasn't the end of the story for the Corcel. Unlike in France, the Brazilian car-buying public wasn't particularly enthusiastic about four-door vehicles, which is why a coupe version was introduced only a year after the car debuted. Even the wagon that launched in 1970 only had 3 doors, with a planned 5-door variant akin to the R12 brake never coming to market. Over the years, there were various styling and trim updates, including a 1973 facelift that featured an enlarged 1.4-liter engine. If you opted for the coupe, there was even a somewhat sporty GT version, with a dual-barrel carburetor and some positively expressive 1970s graphics. The restyled second-generation Corcel launched in 1978, but this wasn't really an all-new model. It looks a bit like they grafted Mark V Ford Cortina bodywork onto a Renault 12, which probably isn't too far from the truth, but I still think the styling works surprisingly well. The 4-door sedan was dropped due to lack of demand, leaving only the coupe and the Baleno wagon. By 1981, you could get an engine with 1.6 whole entire liters.
Wow!
In 1982, Ford figured out how to extend the life of its aging family car on two fronts. Firstly, there was the Pampa, a utilitarian pickup to compete in the emerging coupe utility segment in Brazil. The little truck had a longer wheelbase than the Corcel, and used a solid rear axle with leaf springs for more payload capacity. They even made a 4x4 version, which, funnily enough, was eventually fitted with Jeep badges in Ford of Brazil's failed attempt to keep the copyright they inherited from Willys. Regardless, the configuration was quite unique among car-based pickups sold in the market. The other Corcel variant, launched in 1982, was a more upmarket sedan and coupe, which, for some reason, they marketed like this. Anyway, this new vehicle was badged as the Ford Del Rey, to make sure everyone knew that it did not associate with the lowly, insignificant peasant Corcel. For how could it? It could be had with power windows, power mirrors, power steering, air conditioning, a sunroof, fog lights, and an automatic transmission. How stately indeed. After around 1.4 million of them were produced, the Corcel was eventually discontinued in 1985, the same year Brazil's military dictatorship ended in democratic elections. I'm sure there's some intelligent historical comparison that could be made there, but this video is taking too long already. Anyway, the Del Rey and Pampa soldiered on. In 1989, a partnership between Ford and Volkswagen, dubbed Auto Latina, was established. This meant that larger Volkswagen engines could now be optioned into some of Ford's models, including the Del Rey and Pampa. So that meant that if you lived in Brazil for a short time in the early 90s, you could get a Ford sedan originally developed by Willys Overland and Renault with a Volkswagen engine. Because that makes sense. The Del Rey eventually ended production in 1991. It was replaced by the Versailles, which, unsurprisingly at this point, wasn't actually a Ford, but was instead based on the Volkswagen Santana. But the Pampa, complete with its Renault 12 3-lug wheels, stayed in production until 1997, almost 30 years after the original Corcel was introduced. The Corcel and its variants, which at different points were also sold in Chile, Uruguay, and Paraguay, with additional production taking place in Venezuela, represents an especially noteworthy chapter in South American automotive history. It's a chapter full of unconventional partnerships and resourceful market-specific adaptations that, in some ways, created a car industry distinct from any other in the world. And without the Renault 12, the Corcel's influence never would have been realized in the first place. Next on the R12's world tour is Romania. The Eastern Bloc country's government, led by dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, wanted to rely less on imports by locally producing a car. Other companies were considered, but after a diplomatic meeting with Charles de Gaulle, French state-owned Renault got the deal. The Romanian government wanted to produce the R12 from the get-go, but the car wasn't actually ready yet. That meant that in 1968, Romanian production of the older Renault 8, dubbed the Dacia 1100, began. But the very next year, the R12 started production in the country as the Dacia 1300. Well, if you were a government official, that is. Sales didn't officially begin until early 1970. At this point, the cars still mostly used French components, save for the, admittedly, very stylish Dacia badging. There really wasn't all that much separating the 1300 from the 12. In 1973, the Romanian market would finally get a wagon version of the 1300, a pickup was launched in 1975, and nearly all components were localized by 1977. While the car had initially been successful, the Romanian economy entered a major slump in the mid-70s. The company needed a new product to drum up interest, which is why Dacia originally wanted to replace the 1300 with a version of the new Renault 18. But instead, their partnership with Renault ended, and fewer than 100 of these cars were assembled, according to Wikipedia. And no, I don't have a better source for that information. Regardless, dreams of a new model resulted only in a new front grille for 1979. The creatively named 1310 update did also feature a slight power bump and minor interior changes, but that was all Romanian consumers really had to look forward to. Unless you were an important official or member of the secret police, because they now had access to the Dacia 2000, which was a rebadge of Renault's most expensive car, the 20. Like Czech Skoda and Polish FSO, Dacia began to export their cars in an attempt to acquire some much-needed foreign currency. At different points, the car was sold in the UK, Germany, Poland, Albania, North Macedonia, Greece, Israel, China, and Canada. There are even some in North Korea, apparently. But that didn't mean the brand's attempts to enter export markets always went well. The UK spec Dacia Denim, for example, was more expensive than other Eastern European options, while lacking the quality to compete with other family cars. It was only available in the country for a few months in 1983, with just a few hundred being sold and 0 currently registered.
At least a few did make it to customers, though, which wasn't the case with the brand's planned US launch. Apparently, there was this guy named John Trotman who promised to bring Dacias to the US in the mid-1980s. That did not happen, even though he supposedly collected millions from would-be Dacia dealers. There was a lawsuit, a lot of angry dealers, and according to the CBS News report from 1987, a whole other guy who claimed he was the one with the right to import the cars. As a side note, there were also 3 different attempts to bring Romanian ARO SUVs to the US, but none of those really ended well either.
Because of Romania's continued economic struggles and the social unrest that swept much of the Eastern Bloc in the 1980s, domestic sales struggled. Even if you were lucky enough to afford one, you could still be put on a years-long waiting list. Car ownership itself was troubled by significant quality issues and fuel rationing. Dacia still didn't have the resources for a new model, so small improvements and variations on the aging Renault 12 platform were all that consumers were granted. One of the more interesting variations, however, was the Sport Coupe, which featured a shorter wheelbase, lower roof, and obviously 2 fewer doors. It went into low-volume production at the start of the 80s, and early versions used the same front doors as the sedan to save cost. This led to a bit of a Morris Merino coupe situation where the proportions just didn't look right. Luckily, an updated version was launched around 1986 with longer doors, minor front and rear changes, and a more powerful 1.4-liter engine with an available 5-speed manual transmission. Considering these are chopped-up versions of a 1960s Renault, I actually love the way these look. The R12's sloping rear trunk, combined with the little black plastic ducktail. Anyway, I'm getting off track here. In 1984, 2 years prior to the Sport Coupe, other variants would get a variety of changes. These include the available 1.4-liter engine and updated front fascia, accompanied by adjustable headrests and a revised dashboard. In 1988, the 1320 was launched, a hatchback version inspired by the Dacia 2000 that was actually sold to the general public. How impressive. The hatchback had more dashboard updates. with a bigger glove box, in addition to a new front end reminiscent of literally every other 1980s economy car. Apparently, this version finally got front and rear sway bars for the suspension, so I suppose that's a plus. By the early 90s, the Iron Curtain had fallen, and a wave of Western competition swept through Eastern Europe. The R12-based Dachas weren't dead yet, as they still offered low-cost, reliable-ish transportation, but the writing was on the wall. The 90s brought a desperate spree of facelifts, variants, and changes to the ancient Renault. 1992 updated the rest of the range with the 1320's front end, with a new integrated rear spoiler. The Sport Coupe ended production after just 5,500 units were made, but a new double cab pickup was introduced. Around the same time, the 1320 got a revised rear end and a new name, the 1325 Liberta. It even got a rear wiper. Look at that. 1994 introduced a new front grille, headrests, and dashboard, along with an available 1.6-liter fuel-injected engine with over 70 horsepower. That new powertrain came from the Dacia Nova, the brand's very first in-house vehicle. Development did begin back in the 80s, and some say it was heavily inspired by the Peugeot 309. Regardless, when it did finally launch in 1995, it still managed to be leagues more modern than the 1310, though that's not exactly a high bar. In spite of the shiny new Nova, sales of the 1310 continued. It got its final facelift in 1999, with a smiling front end that, to my eyes, looks comically out of place on a 1960s Renault. Some Romanians, however, say this car has Iliescu's smile, referring to the country's contemporary president. By now, the Liberta hatchback was gone, with the 1310 name being dropped in favor of Berlina for the sedan, Brake for the wagon, and Pickup for the pickup. A limited edition Dedicati version was intended to celebrate the 1300's 30th anniversary, and was offered with power windows, aluminum wheels, and even painted bumpers. How decadent. But by the end of the 90s, Renault had taken a controlling stake in Dacia, and the Berlina and Brake finally reached the end of the road in 2004. But strong demand actually kept the pickup alive. I haven't mentioned it much for the sake of time, but much like the Ford Pampa, there were a significant number of interesting variations over the years. Somehow it was offered with front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, and four-wheel drive, multiple cab and bed configurations, and starting in 2002, a Renault diesel engine. The last R12-based Dacia, a red 1307 double cab pickup, rolled off the line in Mioveni on December 8, 2006. Throughout its 37 years of production, the Dacia 1300 lineage was a symbol of immensely difficult times, but also resilience. It outlived the dictatorship in which it was conceived and became a significant cultural artifact for a multitude of Romanians. And considering that over 2 million of them were produced, it's easy to understand why. For decades, the Renault 12 was also ubiquitous in Turkey, long after the car ended production in France. It was locally produced there with minimal changes from 1971 all the way until 1989, when it got a small refresh, which basically just meant more black plastic, and a name change to the 12 Tauros. Engine improvements were made over the years, and a new 5-speed transmission was introduced with the Tauros. Renault Turkey didn't really have to do much to change its version of the 12. Its perception as a locally built, simple, dependable car kept it on sale until the year 2000, when the archaic architecture couldn't meet new European Union regulations. Turkish-built R12s were exported to a whole host of countries, including Lebanon, Azerbaijan, Congo, Senegal, Mauritania, Niger, and Mali. In several parts of Africa, particularly in the north, the R12 joined the ranks of the Peugeot 504 as one of the most noteworthy and dependable vehicles on the entire continent. In addition to Turkish exports, the R12 was locally assembled in Morocco in a factory that also produced the Renault 4, which, as many of you likely know, is another vehicle with a massive global influence. I guess Renault kinda has this world car thing down, or something. In Argentina, the 12 was produced largely unchanged until 1994. Like in other parts of South America, also being locally assembled in Chile, Colombia, and, of course, Brazil, the vehicle enjoyed significant popularity. In fact, nearly 450,000 Argentinian R12s were produced over its long life. It was launched just after Renault bought out IKA, another one of the Kaiser Corporation's South American subsidiaries, which was a turn of events that also resulted in the Rambler American-based Pininfarina-styled Torino being sold as a Renault until 1981, which seemed normal. Anyway, this meant it was significantly more similar to the global R12 than the Brazilian Corcel. In its later years, it received an update akin to the Turkish R12 Toros, but arguably the most interesting Argentinian version of the car is the incredibly rare 1978 Alpine. Fewer than 500 of these performance models were made, featuring a 1.4-liter engine with an improved exhaust and dual-barrel carburetor, an aggressive hood and body kit, and a choice of 3 distinctive two-tone paint schemes. While its 108 horsepower wasn't quite a match for the Gordini, I still think it's a very cool piece of automotive history. Moving on to North America, the Renault 12 enjoyed a reasonably long life in Canada. It was locally assembled via knockdown kit in Quebec, well, at least until 1973 when the factory's contract with Renault expired, and even received a Nordic special edition. This trim package included aluminum inner fenders, a standard rear window defroster, more rust protection, mud flaps, and a 66 horsepower 1.4-liter engine. As the name implies, the Nordic was marketed in areas with harsh winters, such as Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. As the name does not imply, the station wagon got a generous helping of fake wood trim. Unfortunately for Renault Canada, sales slowed to a crawl in the last few years, with only 225 units finding homes in 1980. Apparently, the Dacia 1310 was actually sold in the country for a couple years in the 1980s, but I can't imagine it was necessarily a raging success. Dacia even sold some two-door sport models there, something the Renault badge version never offered. In the US, R12s are similarly obscure. Renault gave the car the R16's larger 1.6-liter engine, something specific to the American market, but by 1976, sales had slipped to under 7,000 units. This also seems to be a good time to remind you all that Renault decided to call the American R5 Le Car. What I would do to be a fly on the wall of that boardroom. Anyway, the R12 left the US market after 1977, just 6 years after its introduction, which sounds like a relatively standard lifespan for a normal car, but is more like a crippling failure by R12 standards. At least it was successful in Mexico, which, surprise surprise, was yet another country where it was locally produced. The 12 was initially well received in Australia, winning Wheels Car of the Year in 1970. Like in neighboring New Zealand, the car was locally assembled via knockdown kits, which I'm sure you've sensed is a pattern. However, Aussie and New Zealander consumer sentiment towards French goods soured in the wake of French nuclear missile testing in the Pacific, showering islands with dangerous levels of radiation. By 1985, that saga had resulted in French state-backed terrorists bombing a Greenpeace vessel docked in Auckland, killing a photographer. And since Renault was state-owned, they were much harder hit than Peugeot, and faced an uphill battle of regaining consumer trust. Renault facelifted the 12 in 1975, renaming it the 1.4-liter after its new engine, before renaming it again to the Virage in 1978. But, understandably, it wasn't enough to save the car's fortune in an era of heightening geopolitical tensions. I could go on and on to further describe this car's influence in countries that still exist, like Spain, and ones that don't, like Yugoslavia, but I've probably done enough of that already. Because if you note all the places where this vehicle was produced and put it on a map, it resembles the development of a horrible worldwide plague. Except that, in most places, the 12 wasn't a plague at all, but rather a simple little car with a hint of style and cultural staying power. While far from Renault's only quote-unquote world car, by the time R12-derived Dacias were discontinued, it had outlived the R18 that replaced it, and the 21 that replaced the 18, and the Mark I Laguna that replaced the 21. Point is, the R12's lengthy and complex history is a testament to the designer's original vision for a universal automobile, and the French Empire's secret plot to make everyone drive a Renault. Or something like that. Thank you so much for watching this video. I apologize for making it a bit of an information overload kind of affair. I knew the R12 was a significant vehicle, but I did not realize it was produced in 785,000 different countries for 22 eons. It turned out to be the perfect subject matter for spending countless hours scrolling on translated web pages in vain attempts to learn about whether the 1.4-liter engine really was available in country number 17 during a 5-year time frame in the mid-1980s. If I had a quarter for the number of Wikipedia rabbit holes I found myself down during the process of writing this script, I would have, like, $2 whole or something. Anyway, you're probably very tired of me right now. So that's good, because given my track record, the next video won't be out until about 2030. So, with all that being said, I hope you have a wonderful day. And, goodbye.